Hi everyone, this is Rick Pearson. I thought that if you were anything like me, you might find it incredibly interesting and possibly very helpful to see what exactly goes into building a shot like this using virtual production techniques inside of the Unity game engine. So, most of us are very familiar with the idea of using LED volumes and complex camera tracking and advanced technology and steep learning curves when it comes to virtual production workflows. And the thing is, you don't need to be a studio with access to all of those things to tell really compelling stories with the help of a game engine. You can do it with something as simple as a smartphone and a powerful laptop and a willingness to learn a new skill. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video is like, I think so that we can do that in the context of looking at this specific clip. So this is my first effort of trying to composite a live action shot, which is happens to be of myself sitting in my living room with in front of a green screen, and I'm sitting in a camp chair, right? So very simple, shot on my Android smartphone. And yet, when I place it in Unity into this 3D world, I get beautiful light wrapping. I have fog that is interacting with the live action plate. And it all feels very grounded in the scene. So let's talk about like how this came about and how it was created. So if we come over to Unity itself, here we have the same view of what we were just looking at. Let's talk about each element that breaks down and how this was made. You might think that, oh, you have to build a forest to make a scene like this work. But if you wanted to tell a story of three people sitting around a fire and having a conversation, you don't have to build this rich, complex forest. It can be something as simple as literally, I have three trees. All of the action happens between these three trees. And then that's it. I have the ground, and I gave myself more ground than I needed because I wasn't exactly sure where I was going to place the camera. That's the only reason why there's so many planes here. And the mountains, you'll notice I didn't put a lot of detail into them. They're not impressive. There's no snow-capped um, hilltops. There's no rich texturing. There's no detailed sculpting. The reason why is because it happens so far in the distance, it's only there to follow or suggest a change in elevation in the background. If you follow my cursor, you can see the change from like you have mountain and then sky. So you just have that. It's just there to be very subtle. So, and it suggests that the world is much larger than it actually is. So with that, and with a willingness to dive into understanding terrain, I utilized a sample asset pack from Unity called the Advanced Terrain Sample Texture Pack, I believe is the name of it, something close to that, to get this ground. Looks very three-dimensional. It looks great, and it looks great from multiple angles, right? Like that still looks like it has texture, and certainly it looks like it has texture in the final frame, and yet it's not sculpted geometry. It doesn't have geometry. It is a flat plane. You can see from the outline that's perfectly flat, and it's simply layered and pixel displaced mapping, texture mapping. So if we click on the plane itself, so I've highlighted this plane, come down into the surface inputs, and you can see that we have a lot of maps working. So you might see that we have bent and height map. These are two additional maps that you might not be used to seeing. And the reason why these are here and activated is because even though I'm utilizing the default HDRP lit shader, there is a pixel displacement happening, and that unlocks the bent and the height maps. And that displacement is really powerful and allows you to get these beautiful textured looks. Before discovering this, before reverse engineering, like this is, I believe, default from the pack itself, but I have since used this to create grass growing through rocks and gravel lots and various rock quarries. You can use this technique to simulate texture in really beautiful, complex ways. And before discovering that, I would have, if you would have asked me, I probably would have said, oh, well, you probably have to, stamp your terrain, add a little photogrammetry, and really just kind of make something much more complicated than it needed to be. And yet you can do this. So let's dive in and look at, we have the plane itself. So in the most popular perception of virtual production, people talk about LED volumes, but I honestly believe that if you just have a green screen, you don't need volumes to create a sense that the world is interactive with your plane, with your live action plate, because you can actually put your plate in the world, right? So what you've got, the sun coming through, light wrapping, makes it all look very real and grounded. And then let's talk about the fire. This I found incredibly intimidating when I first began because it's the visual effect graph, and it just seemed like everyone who had lessons to teach on visual effect graph went from 0 to 60 in no time flat. So this is how I learned to wrap my brain around it. I started by finding a tutorial on smoke, and that gave me access to this, the smoke texture book that's kind of, wafting up into the air. I then, once I dissected that and reverse engineered it and played with all the settings to find out what everything did, I just modified that for the fire effect. So if you look at the actual fire, so fire circle, you can see that we have fire. I will turn that off, the flames off, but you'll still see the smoke is happening. That's because I did not try to create fire and smoke in one effect graph. I kept it simple. I broke it down into bite-sized nuggets. And so here we have flames, at which I just replaced the smoke flipbook texture with a flame flipbook texture found online. And then I changed the vertical travel to more of a horizontal randomized travel. So it looks like the flames kind of dance and spread out side to side. And I tweaked all the settings until I had what looked like a reasonably believable fire. And then I threw in the steam or the smoke on top of it. And together, they give me something that I feel pretty good about. Here in the final image, especially with depth of blur on, it looks absolutely believable. So let's talk about other ways of selling the visual quality of things. If you are absolutely new to Unity, you probably aren't thinking that there's anything special happening with the sky. But if you know anything about Unity, you might be thinking, well, how is it that you have an HDR sky texture? Like you can see the clouds and everything from this image that's brought in, this cube map, but you also have a sun. The sun is not part of that HDR sky. So the reason why this is kind of special, and I learned this from a YouTube video myself, the reason why this is special is because if you were to utilize, let's switch the physically based sky to an HDR sky. Now, this is a different HDR sky. It's more of like a night. You can see stars and such, but you'll notice the sun has disappeared. The light is still coming from that direction, although it's dimmer because of the settings, but you'll notice that even though the directional light still exists, here it is, the sun, there, right there. There's this light, but it's actually baked into the map, the cube map. And I'll demonstrate this by rotating my sun. You see how the light changes direction, but that light, it's part of the image, so it does not change. And yet, HDR sky is what enables us to have an image in the sky. If we switch over, back in our sky and fog volume, if we switch from HDR sky to physically based sky, I'm going to turn off the HDR sky. So, which I'll explain this in a moment. So this is a physically based sky. It's very generic. It's just blue, and then it kind of changes toward the horizon, and then it gives you whatever color, happens to be brown, by the way, for your ground plane or your perpetual background. But the benefit to a physically based sky is that you can see the sun. And if I select my directional light, you can see that as I move the angle of the directional light, I can move the sun as well. So what I wanted in creating this scene is I wanted control over the sun placement, and I wanted to physically see the sun, but I also wanted to have a rather nice HDR sky. And the method by which I was able to do that was stumbling upon a tutorial that taught me how to use a physically based sky as my visual environment. And then a physically based sky setting, I turn on the space right here, space settings. So turn these on. And that gives me access to, it basically allows you to have your cake and eat it too, right? That's really powerful. So now you can move that light around, and it looks like it's moving in a real sky. And this real sky is having an effect. It's coloring this world that we are in, right? So it's having an effect. Like it's the colors of the sky and the intensity of it are coming in and influencing the colors and the shadows and everything in the world. So that was a really neat trick. And I encourage you to like play around with that yourself as well. It's a great way of having everything at once. So the other thing that is happening in the clip is that the vegetation has wind, stimulated wind effect. Now, this does not happen in Unity out of the box. You would have to write a custom shader. And to be honest, that's above my knowledge at this point in my learning journey. So the way I came about implementing this was I stumbled upon, through a lot of research, a set of shaders, of animated wind and interaction shaders that goes by the name of the vegetation engine in the asset store. So you can buy the vegetation engine. And the beauty of this is that it literally allows you to grab any prefab, right? This is just a bush prefab, and it's static. There's no animation to it whatsoever. But by placing the vegetation engine manager into your scene and then selecting a prefab, you can then open the prefab converter, convert it, and what that does is it replaces the default shader for the prefab that you are converting. It replaces the default shader with a wind and interaction shader, and then it maps all of the textures back for you. That's so incredibly handy and useful, and it's fast. So it's basically a one-click type of deal. Once you've converted that, then you can open up material settings, and you've got access to all of the wind options. So bending amplitude of your branches, you've got rolling of settings for branches, leaf settings, so how much your leaves flutter about, and then interaction for if a character or any collider goes through your vegetation, how does your vegetation react? If someone walks over it, walks through it, and so forth. There's a lot of rich settings to go in. But so that's how I implemented that for myself. Now, the more you play with those settings, the more realistic you're bound to get. And I think that this could be made much more realistic, but I was super happy with this in this clip, because at the time that I was creating this clip, I wasn't focused on one thing. I set out to create this clip because I told myself, I want to build something that challenges me to do a live composite of a live action recorded clip. I want to make it feel grounded with the light and so forth. I want to have animated vegetation, and I've wanted to force myself to step up to the plate with visual effect graph and dive in and stop being intimidated by it. And so I forced myself into a situation with a campfire where I knew I was going to have to do smoke, and I knew I was going to have to do flame. So, and with the wind. So all of these things came together, and I'm quite happy with it. So this is a tremendous thing. Now, this clip does not, here's the beautiful part. This does not have to be a pre-recorded clip. It can be a live camera feed. It can be a wireless webcam type of feed. It can be an SDI or like a deck link feed. So you could have your computer on a set and have a camera feed into it and then you could have your environment, and then your actors are on stage on the green screen, and you could literally just grab your plane and then just move them about to place them wherever you might need them to be in the world and change it shot by shot. Do whatever you want. You can change it take by take, right? So that's beautiful stuff. And it's all real time. So let's talk about visual fidelity. So right off the bat, let's look at the final frame. Let me go to the post-processing volume. So if I turn post-processing off, you're going to see a big change. It gets quite garish. Post-processing is this, we're all familiar with how instrumental it is in crafting a final image, but there's a lot of people who say, well, you just make a very flat image in the game engine and then do your work elsewhere. You can. There's nothing wrong with that. But if the tools are here and they are sufficient, I'm going to use them. So here in my post-processing volume, you can see without it, everything is stark. There's no fog. My plate, my live action plate, doesn't really seem to match with everything else that's here in the scene. And the colors of the vegetation are garish, to say the least. So let's turn post-processing back on, and you can see that it desaturated everything. So let's start with the fog. So if I turn the fog off, you can see that everything's stark, and it just has a very weird feel to it. So I'm a big proponent of fog. I even love volumetric fog for most things. So here's regular fog. Here's no fog at all. This is base fog. And now with volumetric fog, it has a really good feel that I really enjoy. I use volumetric fog in everything, maybe to a fault. I'm not sure. Now, tone mapping allows you to change the color space of your project to ACES, which is the default of kind of what you should use. It's the most cinematic option available to you, but I'm not entirely certain that when working with HDRP that you are required to use tone mapping, because you'll notice when I turn it off, default HDRP looks exactly the same. But I go ahead and I hard set it to ACES anyway, so that I know for a fact that I'm always getting it. Ambient occlusion is all about shadows, and it gives, to me, it gives gravity and weight to a scene. So let's look at it with no ambient occlusion. The two biggest things are, you can notice that all of the shadows that are in the leaves, the shadows are there, but they don't seem to add upon one another, and the shadows don't accumulate, right? It looks much more dense and more real with ambient occlusion. The other thing I want you to look at is right here where the stones meet the ground. So this is ambient occlusion on, and with it off, see how it looks like it's a 3D element. It's just there's no natural shadow or accumulation of shadows where the objects intersect. So to me, without ambient occlusion, it looks very 3D and it looks strange, but with it's got this natural beauty, right? So that's really wonderful. Ambient occlusion. Chromatic aberration, I have it turned off, but if you turn it on, it gives you this really great prismatic effect that is natural in most lens elements. So with intensity, so it's 0.3. So if I turn it way up, it goes crazy, but you can see in the corners on the side. So it mainly affects the outer edges of your lens, and you can see that it acts as a prism almost, separates your color spectrums. And as we dial that down, it looks more akin to what you'd find. Oops, I don't want to do max samples. I want to do intensity. If we just put a little bit in, it looks very close to what you'd see in a film or television show or program that you are accustomed to seeing. It's very nice. I am a big proponent of using it. I struggled with using it in this specific clip for one reason, and that is because of the composition of where I place myself within the scene. And remember how we talked about how chromatic aberration affects the outer edges? Well, you'll note, look at the quality on my video playing on myself. It just took too much of the sharpness I felt away. Whereas without it, it felt like I was in really good focus. All right. That's why I did it. It was a personal choice. And color adjustments, it always looks more real if it's desaturated, and it just keep in mind, if you mess with the saturation, you're going to have to compensate with the contrast in the opposite direction. So without the desaturation, you can see it's just kind of a little too bright, maybe a little too cartoonish, but that looks very real, very nice. And of course, on the camera itself, which is here, the VCam, which is, let's find it. Here we go. I have depth of field override on. So if I turn it off, you can see everything is in focus, right? And it's not bad, but it's not what I was looking for. So with a simple depth of field override and then some, dialing in the settings, you get a very nice look. So all of this, here's the kicker. All of this was done with a smartphone and a 2020 M1 chip Apple MacBook Air with 8 gig RAM. That's it. No RTX card, no fancy machine. Although arguably the M1 is fancy because it's a beast. So all of this plays back in real time, right? Which means it exports in real time. That's tremendous. So all of this created with, it just took some a willingness to learn how to do a thing and put it all together. So I started by learning one element, learning another, learning each thing one by one, learning about textures, learning about HDR skies, excuse me. And in doing so, then I finally reached a place where I thought, okay, what can I do to challenge myself to put it all together? And this is what I came up with. So if you're interested in virtual production, especially if you're interested in using Unity game engine for virtual production, you don't need an LED volume. You can do it with any camera you have, as long as you can get that footage into your computer, whether live or pre-recorded, and just play around, build your scenes, and see what you can come up with. Because I think you are going to be amazed at the opportunities that it opens up for you. And the more you play around with it, you will find that the intimidation just goes away, and you will become extremely proficient, and you will start getting very adventurous with your experimentation within the game engine to create really great stories. All right, so that's it for this. I just wanted to kind of like show you what went into building a clip that does not use an LED volume, but does embrace everything that virtual production has to offer. And I wanted to show you how those elements came together and how what the thought process was with it. And remember, you don't need to build gigantic worlds. You can see this is very small. You don't have to build a gigantic world to give a very large impression. All right. So I wish you much luck. And I hope that if you are creating your own stories within Unity, that you'll share them with me here, because I want to know about them. I want to see them. I want to not only cheer you on, but if you do something that I want to wrap my brain around that I can't figure out, I want to learn from you as much as hopefully you're learning from me. All right, so let's progress together, and let's explore and build and create really interesting stories, large and small, within Unity. All right, I'm excited to see what you create. I hope you continue to be excited about what I create and share here on this channel. And my name is Rick Pearson. I thank you for watching, and until the next video, I'll talk to you then.